Thank you for joining us today. Our topic is mechanics of rebuilding your home. A little bit about United Policyholders. We're a nonprofit that's focused on helping consumers with disaster recovery. We've been in operations since the 1991 Oakland Hills wildfires. We serve as a trusted information resource and voice for insurance consumers in all 50 states. We're funded exclusively by donations and grants. We don't take money from insurance companies. We're not for profit, not for sale. We have a small professional staff that is highly leveraged with what we call Team Up, our government, business, and nonprofit partners, and then our volunteers. We have our survivor volunteers who are previous catastrophic loss survivors who want to pay their experience and knowledge forward, and consumer-focused professionals in these various fields that can help you with the claims process. We have 3 programs: our Roadmap to Recovery, our Roadmap to Preparedness, and Advocacy in Action. And today's program is our Roadmap to Recovery, which, as the slide says, focus on insurance, restoring assets, and getting back home after a loss. Our Roadmap to Preparedness is where we take those lessons learned from the disaster and share that information with others in the hopes that if they experience a loss, they're in a better position. And then Advocacy in Action is where we take those pain points that people find in a disaster and we advocate to improve the rights that they have and increase those protections. We have resources online to help you. This is our California 2021 library. This is our Marshall Fire Library. And then I almost forgot, we also have our yellow recovery guide. If you prefer not to be a digital native and you prefer that yellow book, just email us and we'll get a copy of that to you. A note of guidance here, recovery is a marathon, not a sprint. So we want you to make sure that you're pacing yourself, you're easy on yourself. There's a lot of information. You're becoming an expert in 20 to 30 different jobs that if you were hiring people to do them, it'd be a lot of effort, people hours, and resources put on it. And so just give yourself some grace here. Let's see, fine print. This workshop is intended to be general guidance only. We are not providing legal advice. None of us are attorneys, nor do we play one on TV. If you have a specific legal question, we recommend that you consult an experienced policyholder attorney. We are not creating a professional client relationship with any individual in this workshop. And then, our speakers today are professionals who are volunteering their time. We're not endorsing them. But they are sharing the information that they're able to with you to help you in this process. And then today's presenters and partners, myself, Valerie Brown, I'm the Deputy Executive Director of United Policyholders. Annie Barber is with me today. She's our California Roadmap to Recovery Liaison and also a 2017 Tubbs Fire Survivor. We have 2 professional volunteers with us today. David Gurley is a California contractor and also a Tubbs Fire Survivor. He is not with us in person. He had an event yesterday, but he recorded a message that we'll share with you in just a minute. Then we have Susan Davids with Frameworks, which is a Colorado contractor. Let's get going. Today's topics, we're going to touch very briefly on the scoop of loss, talk about permits, vetting and hiring a contractor, contracts themselves, builder's risk policies, paying your builder, fund control, cost saving options for rebuilding, and then building code upgrades. And these are the pieces that wrap up our module on the rebuilding process. And with having said all that, I'm going to get us to take a deep breath here. And then we have our message from David Gurley. And I think, let me stop sharing my screen because I don't see how to make it play here. So I want to just start with his quote here, which is, "It's going to be okay." And let me share that message. There we go. And let me play that.
My name is David Gerling, and my family and I survived the Tubbs Fire in 2017 in Sonoma County, California. I came from a background of working as for a general contractor as a project manager for the federal government. So I built a lot of stuff, but the first home that I built as a residence was my own after the fire. The odd thing was that my insurance policy was woefully inadequate to begin with. The greatest message that I could provide to anybody with regard to that is don't take no for an answer and keep pushing and enlist as many allies as you can with other insureds from the same company, from the state, the Department of Insurance for your state, anybody else that you can find, United policyholders, advocacy groups, things like that, that are set up in order to support you in your recovery. It was indeed a United Policyholders meeting, which I learned that the Department of Insurance was on my side and that actually they would be standing up for me if I had a complaint, and that actually I should, at the first inclination to do so, file a complaint to enlist the Department of Insurance as an ally of mine. That was an integral part of increasing my insurance coverage retroactively, which doesn't happen often, but because of a couple of different details, I was able to achieve. It meant the difference between building a very small, modest home and building a slightly closer to what I had before home with a bit more complexity. One of the things that I've learned since then is that my insurance company, although they've been made out to be the evildoers in these processes, and oftentimes are, paled in comparison to my mortgage company. And it's an important distinction to draw between the two, because the insurance company is going to pay you and the mortgage company is going to hold enough money out of those proceeds to guarantee that if you decide midstream to move to South America, that their interest in your property, your mortgage balance, is secure and that they have the cash to cover that. My mortgage company was a drag from start to finish, and I cannot count the number of conversations in which I started with one person and had to chew my way up the chain of command to try desperately to find someone who could help. Needless to say, it worked out in the long run, but it was a rough go. That's why we hire general contractors, so that they can take care of these things for us, hopefully. In hiring a general contractor, it's really important to remember that all of the rules that are going to be spelled out by this United Policyholders webinar are great information. In addition, as much as you can plan ahead, pick out as much of the detail work of your house, doorknobs, light fixtures, plumbing fixtures, doors and windows, everything you can that you can pick ahead of time is going to be worthwhile in the long run, because doors and windows seem to always be the problematic element of building a home as far as lead time, availability, and cost. My experience of construction is that there are two prime elements: time and money. And the more you have of one, the less you need of the other. But everything that changes after it's down on paper means either more time or more money or both. So as much as you can figure out beforehand is going to serve you well in the long run. As you go through your design, think ahead. Ask people who have been through, everybody knows somebody who's been through a fire at this point. If not, ask around with your friends neighbors and relatives and see if anybody else somewhere else in the country knows someone who's a fire survivor or a catastrophe survivor of any kind. See what detail work they've added to their home at the outset in order to maximize the value of their home when they move in. Things like water flow meters, high efficiency light fixtures, high efficiency water fixtures, plumbing fixtures, solar panels, batteries, electric car chargers, all sorts of stuff is available that's less expensive to install while the construction is happening than it would be after the fact. I don't know if you can see behind me, but I put speakers in the ceiling of my living room, and totally cheap when I did it, and way more expensive, almost impossible to do after the fact. Little things, creature comforts that make the house your home. Consider those things when you are rebuilding. Last point is, it's going to work. It's going to work out. You're not alone. And my work with United Policyholders has taken me to various fires around the Western United States. And every opportunity that I have to sit with people who are fire survivors of other fires, much less my fire, the Tubbs fire, has been a day that has been of enormous value to me as a fire survivor. So it's going to work out. There's a huge and growing, sadly, community of fellow fire survivors who are here to support you. So if you need help, ask, reach out, let us know what we can do. Let me know what I can do. I'm available. Thank you very much. And thanks to Amy and the whole crew at United Policyholders. Good luck.
All right. Well, thank you, David, for sharing that. And David touched on a lot of the different pieces that we're going to talk about today. Annie, I'm going to just ask you, am I showing the right slide?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Always worried I'm going to have the tech snafu when I mix up the routine. Yeah. So with following up with what David said, just again, that guidance of pacing yourself, avoiding anxiety-driven decisions. These are the things that we know from other survivors create anxiety. Seeing someone else progress faster than you, getting questions from people who weren't impacted, wanting to know what you're doing and when you're doing it. Inquiries from your insurance adjuster about when you're going to start rebuilding, what decisions you're making, and talking about when ALE ends. All of these create anxiety, which can lead you to make bad decisions. So again, giving yourself some grace and realizing it does take time, and you're going to juggle with those pieces and make the time that you need to for this. And next slide, Annie, I'll let you narrate your rebuild process here.
Okay, so my rebuild happened rather quickly, and only because I was given the resources to make the decision in a much timelier fashion, but also because I used a bigger builder. And by doing that, I got economy of scale. This is where they're just putting in that they've graded it and they're just starting to lay before pre-foundation. This was foundation. I rode my bike over to Coffee Park and saw this happening and was utterly thrilled. There's nothing like rounding the corner and seeing something positive happening. Sticks in the ground is what this is called. The framing, house is starting to form up. As Val was talking previously, my house gave people, because it was one of the early ones, joy and some positive thoughts. It also gave people anxiety because they weren't at this stage. So here they're starting the interior. You can kind of get a good picture of what the outside looks like. This was a 6-month build because it was a master plan. It was a big builder. I said, I want that house. And he did it in a very methodical 20 foundations. Then those 20 got framed and 20 more foundations were pulled. So it was a system of efficiency. And there's my beautiful house.
Thank you for sharing that, Amy. And then at the same time, we had in the Thomas fire, we had a very different timeline. And so this fire was also in 2017. Our volunteer Nancy, her lot was cleared in July. 10 months later, she was here. 18 months later, she's finished inside, outside. But if you go to the back of the house, on the inside, everything was still going. It took her, they had to take all their contents money for their rebuild. So instead of buying furniture and having a real dining room set, they bought their patio furniture and used that for about 6 months until they were going. It took them 2 months to get their front door hung. So overall, almost 20 months from start to finish of getting it done. And what's interesting for them is they took their time interviewing builders. They started the process of, about 9 months down the road. And what she shared is that while many people were out the gate early, like Annie was, a lot of them just grabbed onto any builder they could find and ended up having to restart the process again. And then Susan, I know you've seen this because you're in Larimer County with the 2020 fire. Anything you'd like to share on that rebuilding process there specifically?
Thank you. I think one of the challenges certainly for that fire was we were already in a booming economy and a booming construction. The competition was fierce, and the availability of various things. I mean, they mentioned windows before, and some of those challenges have just created more issues. I think one of the key factors that I've seen is the people that band together, the neighbors that do things together. And as you mentioned, building 20 houses at once is a whole lot easier and faster and more efficient. So that would be probably the most successes in those that try to do it in a group and move forward in that way.
Well, thank you for that. Annie, I'm going to say in the Q&A, you've got a question about Grizzly Flats, and I know you were just talking to the folks there. So I'm going to pass that over to you while I keep going here. So to start our conversation about the mechanics of rebuilding, I'm going to take us back on the insurance piece to one of the most important things for setting that stage. The last workshop, we talked about this briefly when we were talking about the financing of rebuilding your home, but that scope of loss is what determines what insurance funds you have. And calculating that as was cost to replace the house you had is so important. Because that's going to give you the value, the dollars that you have on the table for that rebuild. And then there's a workshop specifically on that. Here's the link for a webinar that we did on that last year. Highly recommend it. It's very technical and detailed. So, it's recorded. Give yourself breaks, but a lot of good information there. And so going back, what does your insurer owe you? So it's like kind and quality. That should be in that scope of loss. They typically tend to use Xactimate, which is not as precise, especially with regards to pricing, as sub-builds, trades, and the estimates that you would get from a professional builder. They typically are not going to pay you for those required upgrades unless you have code upgrade coverage. It's a rare insurer that will do it if it's not part of your policy. And be aware, you don't have to rebuild the identical house. but the payout is limited to what you've had before. So if you had, a 2,500 square foot house, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and you're going to rebuild 4 bedrooms and it's 2,500 square feet, it's roughly, they're gonna owe you for everything except maybe some of the fixtures in that 4th bedroom, right? And do be aware, you don't have to rebuild that identical house. I'm going to repeat that. I had a friend in 07 who wife was so excited because the only benefit she thought she got out of the losing her home in the fire is that she got to design the kitchen of her dreams. Her house was built in 72. Her husband decided he liked it, knowing exactly where everything was in that kitchen. They were an older retired couple. And so he insisted on rebuilding the plan they had, which meant that when the dishwasher door was up, you could not open the side drawer to get anything out. So he replicated even the mistakes in the rebuild. So you don't have to do that. You do get to, your funding is based on what was. And that's why, again, reaching that dollar amount in that scope of loss is so important. I mean, and here's the language that you would typically see on a policy for that. And so often the insurance settlement claim process for the dwelling is going to begin with them preparing a scope of loss. Like I said, most likely an exactimate. Not all of them do. Sometimes they're just going to offer you policy limits outright. Sometimes they're going to give you the actual cash value and say, once you have a contract and start rebuilding, you can do the drawdowns for the rest of the funds available to you. That scope of loss is going to detail the materials, the quantities and range of work needed to repair, rebuild what you had prior. And it's different from an estimate, right? An estimate, a scope of loss is more detailed, and the estimate is going to provide pricing for those line items. And so documentation to describe that pre-loss condition. If you've got building plans, that's great. Any photos, interior, exterior, Google Earth, timeline, these are all ways to obtain that. Zillow, realty websites, any of those that'll give you that, any information on that. And this is if you, have, these are resources available to you. Okay. And then again, the details matter so much here. What kind of, what materials your ceiling were? Was it an 8-foot, a 10-foot, a 12-foot? Did you have special ornate molding? All those finishes and fixtures matter. Any special conditions, rounded corners are so much more expensive. Arches, alcoves, they all add to the cost of rebuilding. Masonry, fireplace, those are the things, if they were in your as was home, that's what they owe you. And so capturing that information is key, because a drop-in fireplace might, Susan, run you $5,000-$10,000. That chimney, 2-story chimney built, masonry chimney might run you $40,000 or up, just depending on which state you're in and if you have earthquake considerations. Here's an example of a scope of loss that was provided by an insurance company. And what we recommend is you can make corrections on it. Going back again, capturing those details. They're saying that this person's height of the ceilings was 10 and a half feet. The correction is that it's a 12. Or you can also provide, if this is more than you're able to do, you can also hire a construction estimating professional to do this for you. And there we go. And this is just an example of an estimate, as I mentioned earlier, that would have the pricing for the units on here. Obviously, Susan, these are not current numbers. These are several years back, and costs have increased greatly here. And this is an example of a trade summary that you might receive from a professional with their bid. Susan, anything you want to add to what you might get from a professional here?
I think it's very difficult. You can come up with ranges, for example, for LVP or, carpet per yard, an average. Some things are changing literally daily. So if, for example, the lumber, for reframing your house literally changes daily now. So it's very difficult to do. I think the only thing I would suggest is that there's a little bit more specifics on the materials used, because they could range. Your carpet could be $5 a yard, or it could be $70 a yard. So that doesn't hurt, and no one can estimate unless they have something specific.
Right. And thank you for bringing that out. The dollars are in the details. You know, you can have, 50-cent cabinet knobs in your kitchen, but if yours were $12 a pop, $20 a pop, you need to reflect what you had. And so we're going to move on to permits now. And so best practices for securing a permit: make sure you've got the documentation you need. You've got check on the resources for getting that documentation. The timing of your application, if there's a waiting period for submitting, you being aware of inspections, and then addressing and resolving problems. So one of the issues that's been identified with disaster survivors across the country with wildfire rebuilds: think about the pros and cons in your community if that permit's going to be in your name versus your licensed contractor. Some communities it's a benefit. Annie, you can certainly share an example of it was to a detriment for somebody from the coffee park community.
Well, we had a builder come in who's actually been not only charged, he's been found guilty of fraud. And so because he took these people for money, started their builds or got their permits for them, there was a huge delay in getting their permits back and what that looked like. And, our city had to really dive into it with their lawyers to find out how they could help the consumers with this process.
All right, thank you for that. And then just to point out that being prepared before you go in, just if you're not prepared, permitting times become a lot longer if they find any problems in the plan check, and it has to go back to your architect, your builder for revision. So making sure you have all those pieces together and before you go in. Susan, anything you'd want to add on that piece specifically?
The different municipalities are getting better at providing a checklist to you ahead of time. And that we do find quite helpful because, for example, in Larimer County right now, it's 60 days, no matter what. And you don't want to get 55 days in and then find out that you're missing something, because that doesn't go over well.
Yeah.
So yes, do the due diligence ahead of time. They're going to ask for trust plans. They're going to ask for engineered things that you can't get around. So take the time to do it right before you submit it.
And a lot of times your jurisdiction is fine. Your plan permit center is going to be very happy if you just come in and ask questions before, because again, once you start that clock ticking, it's moving. But you can go in and make an appointment and just sit down and ask them what it looks like. If you've got a question about something, take that question. And for the most part, we find that they're very receptive to helping. And if they're not, reach out to your elected official and say, hey, I'd like a little more help here.
Yeah, and if you don't pass plan check and your plans have to go back to the architect, that's a big stop, because then your architect in this scenario of rebuilding in a catastrophe where they're busy all the time, then they have to make the time to fix the plans and then resubmit. So you want to get around that. So you want to make sure your architect is well versed in their job.
The other thing I'll mention is a lot of the vagaries, because the building codes have gone to the 2021, and there's a lot of energy related items in there that are probably the biggest differences. And having that clearly defined, whether it's some areas will let you stick with the 2018, and possibly, for example, in the Marshall Fire section, they're allowing some of that to be extended. But that's probably the biggest variable I see going forward.
Yeah, and thank you. That led right into the next slide. And just as Susan said, it so depends on your jurisdiction. In California, it really varies where you are. Some municipalities are waiving it wholesale so that they're grandfathering people in. Others are saying you've got to go through for the energy efficiencies. And if you need a site by site exclusion, because for example, solar is not going to work when the tree canopy regrows, and they're waiving that consideration, but knowing what the options are, and knowing what's impacted by that. I did see the question, and I know Annie's typing the answer about an architect to develop home plans, and just I'm going to step into it just with things I know, and then please Susan and Annie hop in on that. The answer, no, you don't need an architect to develop your home plans, but you do want someone with some professional expertise to look at and review those plans. And so David, who did our video, actually, because he was a builder, he just ordered his plans online. And then he vetted them and made sure, and then went into the permit center to make sure that he'd caught everything, because he wasn't, like you said, he worked government builds, not a residence. I have a friend who hired an architect that built her, after the Cedar Fire, a lovely, who designed her a lovely roof with 30 some different elevations. Her builder said she could have a $250,000 roof, or she could let him accomplish what she wanted with about 5 and save her about $200,000 on the roof. So, being aware of, like, what is the purpose of having an architect? So Susan, I'll pass it over to you, and then Annie, I'll pass that back to you.
I think what you mentioned is very good. I think, there are certain design functions that they perform. There are certain, they look at some of the structural, most of that goes to an engineer to make those definitions. But I would say in a lot of, there is a desire to get them offline, because it certainly saves some money, but there's also some things that get lost in, this might have been built in Missouri, and that doesn't necessarily work in the mountains, or the foundation's not going to line up, and somebody else is going to have to figure out how to do that. So I would say, as you said, to have somebody review it, even if there's a starting point of a set of drawings you get offline, there should be somebody else looking at it.
And even if your neighbor is going to let you borrow the plans, you want to build the exact same house, that foundation could be totally different. You've got different incline. In Colorado, you've got the expansive soils. Your neighbor might not have it. You do. All those things drive into the equation. Annie?
I don't know that I really have much to add, except that, the code upgrades. I would like to touch on that real quick. Those can get waived by certain communities. But also know that if you have insurance in those buckets, you don't necessarily want your community to waive them across the board, because then your insurance won't necessarily pay for that bucket. And so people who do have insurance for that will not be able to get those code upgrades.
Right. And in Colorado specifically, the insurance commissioner has weighed in, I guess, with an advisory notice saying, if the jurisdiction waives it, they still expect it to be paid, but that's not the force of law. So just being aware of that.
And I'll give you a specific example of that. You may have a set of plans that show 2x4 walls. Well, the energy code is requiring an R36 from an insulation standpoint. You can't get that in a 2x4, so it's got to be 2x6, which means everything changes.
Right. Yeah, it makes a heavier, a lot more expensive home. Yes. All right, we're going to touch on contracts now, and we'll run through some guidance, and then just as before, Susan and Annie chime in at any point. So overall guidance, your contract should outline the scope of work, the price, points of completion that payment will be due. You want to make sure that contractor agreement draw schedule is consistent or more favorable than your lender's disbursement schedule. Like David said, if your mortgage lender is, holding not letting go of your funds quickly, you want to make sure that you've set it up where you can keep making progress. Because as Susan said, if your contractor is waiting for a draw to be paid, and the price of lumber is changing daily, you don't want to be in a situation where material costs, by the time they're paid to go to the next step, costs have gone up. You want to avoid that. Contractors should not be asking you for full or cash payments before the job begins. In California specifically, it is, they're only allowed to have a certain dollar amount in that contract as earnest money. Susan, I'm sure Colorado's got something similar in contract law.
I'm not sure about some of those things. We asked for the 10%, and then when there's a start of work, pretty much like you've outlined, because we don't want to have that much overbilled up front either.
Right. And then not letting the contractor get ahead of the draw schedule. And then builder's risk, we'll talk about that in a little more detail, but we highly recommend it, especially, in areas where you've got a wildfire risk and other things, just being aware of that. Someone in the chat had asked who pays for it. The recommendation that we received yesterday from one of the large builders in California was that the terms are more favorable if the homeowner gets it. At least for the state of California, homeowners allowed to buy it as a 1-year contract. Contractor can only get it in 6-month terms. And but having said that, typically that would be included in your costs, your contract for rebuilding. It's just whose name is going on making the purchase. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail in just a minute. So contract review considerations, what's there, should be overhead and profit. Sometimes that's missing on the scope of loss estimate that your insurance company provides. They assume people are going to build exactly at cost, and ignore the fact that this is a business that's trying to be a business. There should be a project schedule, and you should be able to see in that schedule continuity of building activities, right? There's not a 2-month gap for this, because again, as David said, you're planning, making as many decisions ahead of time as possible so that that schedule can be adhered to, because it's either time or money. And, ideally you're keeping yourself on track with time, so you're saving money. Typically what we find isn't there that you might want to have in there is having, sometimes you'll see penalties for not being on time, a finish end date, a start date, language about what inflation material costs would be. And as Susan mentioned earlier, that's complicated. We're starting to see some contracts that are just time and materials, which is, from a homeowner standpoint, feels very open-ended. And so not something we would recommend. And then building in there, again, those lead times for material orders, making those decisions ahead of time, because I was talking to someone in Colorado 2 months ago, and their plan was they'd be finished with their build in 12 months when I met with them in March. And they had to order their appliances, the next week. So being aware of what you need to do. So all of that is in there. You don't want to be waiting, because Annie had shared a story about one of her friends who was waiting 2 months to get the windows so that they can move into the home. You're not going to get your final occupancy without certain things. And make sure that contract is not an estimate. It is a real contract. And most of us are not professionals. I mean, Susan is an exception here. Hire professional help when you need it. Most of us don't know how to review a contract. We don't know how to set this up. So know your limits and hire professional help when needed.
And that was huge in our fire. There was many people who, as survivors and as the ebb and flow of builders and worrying about whether they would get a builder, they were afraid of upsetting their builder by asking, saying that they were going to take it to an attorney to have it reviewed, like that would be questioning their builder. A few builders came in with estimates, so there was no recourse because there was no legal contract. So really do your homework and make sure that you know what you don't know. I fully realize that I'm not an architect, I'm not an interior designer, and I'm not an attorney. So I really had to rely on the people who did know those fields.
And Susan, anything you would share here? Like best practices you would want people to see or expect?
No, I think in our case, what we typically do is we have a pre-construction agreement so that we can lay out what the specifications are. And in some cases, it's a fixed contract, but there are some items that, we don't know what tile they're going to pick. We don't know what appliances they're going to pick. So we put allowances in there.
Yes, thank you.
The thing that I would suggest is make sure the allowances provided are realistic numbers. Because, if they expect you to pick, 30 cents a square foot tile, that's not realistic. And you're going to be in for a surprise when you decide on something else. So that I would look at pretty carefully because it doesn't do anybody any good to underestimate those. The scheduling, I will say that a lot of it is somewhat subject to availability. As we said, what we do in the pre-construction and in our contract, the things that are not selected, we say you must select them by, or we will be moving your end date. Because we can't be held up either. And we don't want to start. And then literally you're 100% right. We're starting a couple of houses now. And the appliances were purchased 6 weeks ago and the windows were purchased also 6 weeks ago, because you can't have those. The appliances are just shocking how long they take.
Right.
But the windows, you can't get past a certain phase and everything just sits and waits for the inspections. So take those things to heart do not want to change your mind after those things are ordered.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to say, can we talk about change orders? I just remember that was the bane of every builder I've talked to. And unfortunately, to the detriment of a lot of homeowners, the idea that I've selected my tile, now I want to change it. Well, depending on what you picked, it might change many more things. So you need to be aware, and that's why making those decisions so early is so important.
Mhm.
All right, let me pop us over. In California, for the state, they do have a home improvement contracts consumer guide. It's it's a way to get yourself up to speed on what to look for in a contract. There's not an equivalent for the state of Colorado, but each municipality has their own tips on what to look for with a builder. I'm going to take a deep breath here. All right, and I love Pia's comment. How do you know what you don't know? And honestly, you're gonna find it out at coming to webinars like this, talking to other people, talking to professionals. The more questions you ask, and we get into this a little bit later, but the more you dive in, the more you're going to learn about what you don't know. We're going to start with vetting and hiring a contractor. So first steps, this is a long-term relationship. So pick someone who communicates well with you. I had two friends who picked two very different builders, and after the Witch Creek fire, she's a librarian who's a chatter. Her husband had interviewed the builder and they worked really well together. The wife was the one making the decisions. The builder basically fired himself because he said, I just want to build the house. I am not going to have an hour conversation every day about what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And so they found a different builder that worked with the person who was making those decisions. And then my other one wanted her builder to make all the decisions for her. She had a little bit of decision paralysis, and he ended up recommending she bring in a designer, not an architect, but a designer to work with her to make the decisions, and ended up putting that in his contract because he wanted to build her house, but he just didn't have the bandwidth to help her make those decisions. And so, being aware of how you communicate, how you work, and finding that team that's going to work, have that two-way communication that works well. The other thing is doing your homework. Proceed with caution. Check out your references. See what other builds and projects they've done. Check their licensing. Check the Better Business Bureau. You know, and when we say check references, I mean, you know, with COVID, I know it's difficult, but see if you can drive by and see the property. In my fire, San Diego, we had the 100-year fire for the Cedar Creek fire, and 1,600 homes or so lost. The Witch Creek fire was 4 years later. So those survivors from '03 who rebuilt with builders, we just went and did toured houses. You know, we got to see their houses and see. So if you like the builder style, you can see the product in action. So see if you're able to do more than just look at a brochure.
Right, and ask the builder for references, actual references that you can call, and ask how the build went. Was there issues with the builder? How was it working with the builder? Was he on time? Were you happy with the final product? You know, was there a money issue? There's a lot of different things, and if you dive in a little bit, those people will tell you, and they may say, quite honestly, well, there was a problem with this or this, but you know, we navigated through it, which is what you want to hear. And our contractor, you know, we have total respect for our contractor because they totally worked with us.
All right. Well, and again, having that trust relationship, because most people did not plan to build a home. This is not this is on very few people's bucket list of things to do when the fire hit. So, you know, having somebody that you can trust to do what you need them to do to make this as easy for you as possible. Getting into the technical part of hiring that professional contractor, you know, making sure they have sufficient workers' comp, general liability, you know, ask, will they name you as an additional insured, provide you the certificates. This would be in addition to your own coverage, which is where you're continuing your homeowner's policy. Or you're paying for your own course of construction insurance, whatever that's going to be. You want to make sure your bids are comparable with similar scopes of work. Susan mentioned this earlier, you know, utilize that project schedule to assist with the planning process. And as she said, eliminating surprises, telling you very very firmly that if you don't make a decision on this, it's going to change your time. So making sure you have all of that. You know, do they exceed state local building codes, or they can simply comply with minimum requirements? One of the things to ask for is getting those lien releases as different phases, you know, different subs are complete their work, so that you know that your home is clear, you have clear title there. Anything either one of you want to add there?
If they do say that they exceed the local codes, if they have a certain level of building, this kind of stuff needs to be in your contract. Some people just build to code. In different areas, it's called different things. Best practices was used in our area, that, you know, they build to above the code levels. And the lien releases are really important, because when you get back in your home, more than likely you don't have any extra money. You've outfitted your home, you've made it to the end, and you get hit with a lien on your house for $80,000, $100,000 for the lumber. That's a tough one to stomach. So you do really want to be keeping an eye out for, in California, it's 6 months that they can put a lien on your house from the time that sub finishes their job. So the plumber comes in, there's 6 months from the time that he finishes to the time he can file that lien. After that, legally, he can't file the lien, but if he does, it's still your job to get that taken off.
The other thing you'll note is if there's a mortgage, when that draw is paid, the contractor signs a lien release at that point.
Right. Susan, flagging, when we're talking about scheduling, one of the questions in the chat was for rebuilding a second home, and this is someone in the mountains. So access is limited to 5 months of the summer due to snow. How would they make that timing work, you know, from a scheduling standpoint? Is that you know, you take it, you get it roughed in and get the envelope enclosed and all that work done in the summer, and then finish the next summer?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times if there's no I mean, in Colorado, some of our best working months are in the winter, because January and February are some of the driest months. Now, you can't necessarily do a foundation when it's that cold if you're going to dig below frost line or down to frost line. that is a challenge because the contractor doesn't like to split up his jobs like that. So what I would do is try, if it's all possible, it's a second home, and 5 months is pushing your luck. So that's about the only thing you can do. Or you can do a, have the schedule of payments accordingly, so that that 100% of the work is done up in that, let's just say 60% of the project, you're paying them up to that amount, but not over. So that 5 months, when the snow is over, or 6 months later, they're still around to finish.
Thank you. Thank you for touching on that. All right, so we've got license resources here, just for when you're checking. Here's the California Contractor State License Board, Colorado, the general contractor license, not at the state level, it's at the local level. So here are the resources for that there. And then for Marshall specifically, there are, I'd mentioned earlier, like information about rebuilding. California had this one piece. So for the 2021 Marshall fire, here's the information about rebuilding in general there. So you've got that. And then hopping next over to contractor warning signs. My fire, we had a builder who volunteered as office manager, and she would do a check of any builder, any contractor, anybody was looking for that was there, give back to the community. He was too full to take any builds. And so he offered her time. And so she was the cyber sleuth who checked and did references and all of that. So, looking for multiple licenses under different names, multiple bond companies. If they've been in business less than 3 to 5 years, seeing if they jumped. Yelp reviews. This is a big one that'll happen with the larger disasters. They claim to be local. They've got an out of area phone number, and they're not licensed in your state, your area. Check the Better Business Bureau, word of mouth. Any of those, social media tools where you can ask a question, nextdoor.com, things like that. See if anybody has anything to say about them. They don't have a permanent business location. One of Tubbs fire survivors shared this one. If it seems too good to be true, it will be. If someone comes in and says, how much insurance do you have? I can build a house for that. You don't know what kind of house they're going to build with the dollars you've got, because that price should reflect your building plans, not how much insurance you've got, right? And because they're two separate things. What your insurance is what they owe you, but what your building should tie into it's a real product with a plan and all of these pieces. And if the builder suggests you pull the permit, not that you've asked, but they suggest you do it, it might be a sign they're not a registered contractor. And so again, these are just warning signs. Obviously, you do a deeper dive. Check on that. Susan, anything you'd like to share with that? I think we've hit on most of them, right?
I think that's a pretty good list.
Anything?
Really, what I can tell you is that the California Contractors State Licensing Board, where you're going to look up the licenses, a lot of the times people will have had issues, and there's a lot of builds in Coffee Park where there was a lot of issues with the contractors, and nothing ever shows up on their license. So I really can't impress upon you enough that you need to utilize all the resources at your disposal to see what kind of person and what kind of business how this is being run. This is your home, your biggest investment for most of us in our lives, and you want to secure that.
Now going back to the builder's risk policies. So what are they? So it's a supplemental insurance policy insuring the builder against losses to the home under construction until it transfers back to your homeowner's policy. And that typically happens when the occupancy permit is final. And this is important when David was rebuilding his house, another contractor building a house in the neighborhood, David said he showed up on Saturday. That builder wasn't working on the weekend. He could smell the smoke. So that person at about 65–70% of their building finished had a fire inside from a cigarette thrown into paint rags. And so for that contractor made it right. He had the risk policy. He immediately fixed it and delayed them about 2 months, but they got back on track, got them home. But without that, it can totally derail your plan. And then payment for the builder's risk policy is generally borne by the homeowner, the person requesting it. You can add it as a line item to the general contractor's proposal. And your homeowner's insurance policy should cover this as part of the job costs. Some contractors may cover it, but generally, like I said earlier, with the California contractor I talked to yesterday, he said pricing wise, it was more advantageous to have the homeowner do it because of the terms of the policy. Now, going back to that being an additional insured on your contractor's insurance, that only pertains to their general liability. That protects you from someone who's hurt on the job site and they sue you and the company that's performing the work. And it's just additional layer of insurance protection for you. And then paying your builder. So start off on the right foot. Remember who works for whom. Keep things jovial and light. Always be professional. And again, don't be afraid to over communicate. And that's different than wanting to talk to your builder every day about what's going on for an hour. But communicating your needs, your questions, making sure that you know what's going on. And when in doubt, ask. If you're confused, clear the air. And as David said earlier, remember the two factors in construction are time and money. The more you have of one, the less you need of the other. And as Susan said earlier, plan ahead. And David gave me one example to share with you. He said pizza for the crew on a Friday is fine. You never bring the beer.
And really, there are no stupid questions. You're a layman at this, and it's the questions you don't ask that usually bite you in the butt. So just ask.
The only thing that I'll add to that is send one email or one phone call with 10 questions, not 10 emails, because that's when things, and it may not certainly be malicious, but things get lost. And there's some miscommunication opportunities. We have a bi-weekly meeting with our clients on the build site. So you have an opportunity to talk about those things, and certainly more frequently if you're in an intensive period where some decisions, if it's a remodel or something, needs to be done. But in general, copy as many people as you are, have a relationship with there, so that every hand knows what the other one is doing and everybody can track the answers, so that you don't get one answer from one and another answer from another, because that can also work both ways. But try to be effective or efficient with your time and theirs when you have these questions, and certainly the response will be well received.
And I think that feeds into that is communicating with the right person. Don't the gentleman who's painting your bathroom at the house is not the one to ask a question about when something's getting delivered. Be respectful, because you're paying their time. That's your money paying their, and if you're taking them off of the job and sending them to go do something because you didn't want to walk over and talk to the right person, that's on you.
There's also something to be said for, let the subs do their jobs. They don't need to be slowed down because you as the homeowner, you want to ask questions and you're excited about something or you don't understand something. You need to let them get their job done so that everybody in the neighborhood, everybody that's signed with that person, can get all their jobs done. If everybody's slowing down the construction crew, nobody's getting done.
And because all of this feeds into balancing your budget and the bottom line, right? Again, planning ahead, taking everything possible as far in advance as possible. Be mindful of change orders, their impact on your final bill, your completion date, going back to time and money. Keep that front and center in your mind here. Be aware of the terms of your contract. Make sure that your contractor is upfront about the impact of those material costs. That, you know, if you've got a question about allowances in the contract, just be very clear with that, and make sure you get your questions answered. Again, that caveat, don't let your contractor get ahead of your agreed draw schedule. And then making sure if it's in your contract that it's fulfilled, right? So in Annie's fire specifically, we had some contractors who had said money for landscaping ended up being used elsewhere, but it was a line item in the budget. And so it's like, no, this is here. And you know, just, and sometimes, I mean, just to be really fair, if they're building multiple homes, they might be mixing up your contract and someone else's. So looking at your contract, making sure it's very clear and keeping everybody on track.
The other thing that I mentioned in the chat or the Q&A was that once, for example, if you have an allowance for the foundation, because concrete prices have varied so much, once your foundation is completed, you should get a reconciliation of your allowance. Now, if it's on door handles, you're not going to get that until the end, but as those allowance items are 100% complete, they should be providing you with the reconciliation, and we'll do that monthly as things are complete. Waiting till the end is a very challenging discussion.
Yeah, and you know, and being aware, I mean, when you're making those decisions, if you've got some, I'm going to use the term float, which is what a builder friend of mine used. You've got some float on your allowances because you ended up going under. You might want to take those funds, and having that reconciliation means you can say, okay, I really want the garden tub, and I've got, you know, 5,000 left for my carpet because I want a lower grade. And so, you know, staying on track of that so that you can make some of those decisions. But again, making sure that those are decisions you can make that aren't going to delay your completion date. Because again, getting back into money there. And then managing your insurance funds. All right, so we've said this again, you know, here's some handouts with this. And we also had talked about this in the previous rebuilding webinar on the finances of rebuilding. So if you didn't catch that one, please go back and watch that one. I'm sorry, I do short, deep breaths. We're going to jump into fund control here. Fund control, or escrow accounts as they're called. Let's start with, if you have a mortgage, your lender should release any amount of the insurance dwelling proceeds paid to you and them that is greater than your principal loan balance. Some of them want to hang on to it, but technically they're only entitled to keep what they have, what they have for the note. If you have a mortgage, they're going to require fund control. And that provides you this added protection, you know, to help you through the process with that fund disbursement, inspections, as Susan said, collecting the lien waivers. So being aware of that. But communication with your lender and your contractor is critical, making sure those things line up and all of those go there. I will say, Annie, I'll just pass it over to you just so people understand that while there might be inspections with fund control, that is not inspections for quality of work.
Yeah. So what we found time and time again in our community that lost 6,000 homes. So 1,400 just in my neighborhood, was that the city and the county inspections really were lacking. They missed a lot of things. They built homes from plan check on that were wrong, using, as Susan said, 2x4s instead of 2x6s, which meant that they couldn't pass the energy efficiency. There is no recourse in California against the city and the county inspectors. So you're kind of left hanging. And so then you want to step up, right, to the California State Licensing Board. That is not a clear-cut solution by any means. So there's kind of a way to do this where, you know, if you have an escrow account, we were kind of afraid of those. It takes all your money for the build into an account. The lender keeps it. They have an inspector who goes out not for quality, but for milestones. And then they okay it. It comes to you to be authorized also. And then your builder gets a check. This is beneficial not only for you, but it's also beneficial for your builder, because if it's set up differently than that, they have huge gaps. They may only get 3 drops of money from the insurance company. This way, they in general are getting about 8. And so it brings the build along a little bit better. It helps them to bridge the gaps. And you're not ever getting ahead of payments. What we found in our neighborhood was that some of the builders, not all of them, we had some good builders too. I don't want to make it like, it was just all a big scam, because it wasn't. But the ones who stood out were the ones who asked for more money before they were entitled to it. They hadn't completed that part of the build. As survivors, the problem is that you become emotional hostages, because you just want to go back home. And when they tell you that they can't finish your build, they cannot move forward without that money, you end up giving it to them. And then unfortunately, what can happen is they can walk from the job or do a halfway job on it, and you've paid them 80% and you only have 50% of your job done. So now you have a 30% deficit, and how do you bridge that and find another builder who will finish it, and you get and get the financing for it? So that's tough. If you have an escrow account, you now have an inspector for milestones, you have an inspector with the city or the county. You also need a private inspector.
We'll talk about that on the next slide. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. So, and so as Annie was saying, if you don't have a lender, obviously consider the escrow account. Many big builders will require it because it protects both of you. And just one thing to note, interest earned on that restricted escrow account should be paid to you when the account is closed. It's not going to be a lot of money. It's a minuscule interest rate, but just be aware that that should be paid to you. Susan, anything to add on fund control? I'm going to pop over to quality control and the private inspections after that.
No, but I will reinforce the escrow factor, because as a builder, you have to count on those funds being available. And, there's sometimes paperwork you have to do for the insurance company, but you don't want to find out when your draw is here that those funds are going to be another 60 days or something, because there's some other hoop the insurance company needs to have you jump through. So having it in escrow gives a certain security that that the process and your schedule is going to move forward accordingly.
And that's why a lot of the more reputable builders will require that, because that way they know you've got your funds on hand. I mean, that eliminates a lot of drama there. All right, so quality control, and Annie, now lean right into that one.
Okay. So, and somebody just asked in the chat, so I'll answer this here too. They asked if their city was doing inspections, and are they checking for milestones only, not quality? I can only speak to what I have experienced, and there's good and bad inspectors out there, just like in every job. There was a lot of things missed. Was it because, they did a quick hire because they needed so many more people? I don't know. But the way you ensure that you don't end up with haphazard things in your house is you hire a private inspector, and it gives you peace of mind. It's about $2,000 or $3,000. They generally do 3 inspections. One, they look at all your plans, they check your foundation. The second one's that close in before, when you have all your plumbing and your electrical done, before they put the sheetrock up.
That way they can check your studs to make sure they're
2x4s. Exactly. And it's just another set of eyes, and it's insurance for you that you're going to get a quality build. So that's, for me, I would not build without that. And I think it's a very small price for the insurance it offers you. You're just not sure. So that in my book would be one of the top things that I would do. You're asking me if the city that you live in is doing just milestones. I don't know. I know that if you have an escrow account, that they're going to check for the milestones, not for the quality. If you have a good builder, it's not going to matter, but you're not going to know that you have a bad builder until you find out.
Well, and so the question's popping up about the, so if you don't know what type of inspection your jurisdiction, your municipality is doing, ask them. That's why we provided that information so you could contact them.
Yep.
And then same for them for independent inspectors. You know, where to find them? I would ask your building department because they're working with them. And usually those people are, from my experience, they're retired general contractors who can't quite retire, but don't feel like climbing on a roof and doing stuff, but they're, you know, they want to keep doing what they love. They're just doing it in the way that works for them.
Or
So
ask your mortgage company. I'm sorry.
yeah,
Company.
reach out to them. Yeah.
That's a great one. I'm going to deal with the next one, the occupancy. So temporary occupancy permit, a lot of disasters, they'll try to kind of push it so that people can get home, and they're being kind and considerate about, you know, let's get these people home. We had a major push before Thanksgiving and Christmas where they were just issuing temporary occupancy permits right and left. The problem is that they don't necessarily have the power to make those builders come back and complete your build. And so try to hang on for that final certificate of occupancy and get everything done off your list. And sometimes it can be really painful those last couple months. Your builder may have started other projects. They don't have as many people on your project because there's less money left. But hang on to that last payment and have your to-do list finished.
The one comment I'll make on that is our contracts, the end date is substantial completion, which means the house, you have your CO, you are able to move into the house. You may have a few punch list items. So it's not reasonable to say I'm going to hold 25% back from you because I've got 2 scratches on the wall. Substantial completion means you can move in and use it for what it's supposed to be. So there's a balancing act, but certainly I agree, hold on to something to ensure that list gets done, or you can pay somebody else to do it if they're not being responsive.
Thank you. And then going back to the mortgage issue with the lender, one of the problems a lot of people share they have is tracking down that authorized signer at the mortgage company. So we have a publication that I believe Carolyn had put in the chat. And then you should have gotten, you'll get this from your lender. You should get a document like this from your lender, who that you contact. And then, obviously you can go up the food chain to, if you're not getting a response there, go up the food chain to their more senior executives. So cost saving strategies for rebuilding. So multiple options here. Master plans, if you've got them, if they're current and relevant to your site. My house is a 72 house. My master plan not going to do me any good. Where I am, it's not even worth it. But I know for several of the communities impacted by the 2020 and 2021 fires, your houses were less than 3 years old. So might be very relevant to your site. Group rebuilds. If you're experienced in construction, buying your plans online, or you're doing that with your contractor and you're having it vetted, that might be a resource for you. One of the strategies a lot of people have used is reconfiguring your space when you rebuild. Because remember, you're not required to rebuild as was. They only owe you for that up to your policy limits. But creating that in-law unit or a rental on your site so that you have a revenue stream that you can put back into your property to handle some upgrades later. Design decisions to save. My example of my friend's 30+ elevations on her roof versus 5. If it saves, style decisions you can make that are not that expensive. Being aware that, if you had 10 foot or 8 foot ceilings before, and you're like, I'm going to go for 12 or a vaulted, understand how much more that's going to cost you. Just in materials. Looking at those ADUs, be aware of your property tax impacts for that. Collective bargaining, we'll talk about that in a little detail here. for, in some of our communities, we find people are looking at tiny homes now, or they're either looking at building an ADU or a tiny home because they're significantly underinsured, and they're looking at building something that they can live in before their ALE runs out, so that they can come up with the funds in a longer term manner to be able to rebuild the house that was. Landscaping, a lot of people they'll do it themselves. They'll put that in the scope of work in their contract that I'm going to handle these 2 tasks. The recommended strategy, depending on what state and what region you're in, is a succulents party. They will take over your yard in about 5 years. So just a couple of little things will just wreak havoc, but they will totally cover your yard. And I think I hit on the self-performing tasks. Let's go to the next slide. So group and master plan rebuilds. Susan, anything you want to share on this slide specifically? What that economy of scale looks like with those things? Oh, you're muted, sorry.
The group builds takes a particular mindset, because what we've done for these upcoming builds is we have put together some like 3 options. And there's a mindset that says, I want to get into this house for a reasonable amount of money. I don't expect it to be my new custom home unless you have the money to do that. But if you're trying to watch your dollars and you can live with that, knowing that you may have the same faucets, say, as your neighbors, only it's in black and theirs is in brushed nickel. That is a really effective way that we found, where you build some economies in there, because the builder is not having to start over again with each particular item in the scope. And if you can do that with a group, whether it's 4 or 20, that certainly is something to look for. It's a little bit challenging in reality, because people always want their own selections and things like that. But if you're really, if money is really tight, then that's really a very effective way to approach that.
Yeah, and for the master plan construction, back to that, like Susan said, if you're happy with as was, and and you're not going to make any changes, that there's a design savings there that potentially you can read. But the reality is that the husband in the kitchen aside with the dishwasher door, most people take that opportunity to do something they would never have done, but now because they're forced into a rebuild, they're going to do it. They're going to add that piece. So being aware of that. Design cost savings to consider, and this is something David spoke about in his recording. The flow meter, solar and or batteries, those LED light fixtures, low flow water fixtures, centrally wired carbon monoxide monitors, smoke detectors, things like that you would not have gone into your current home and done, because they're very expensive to do. But when you're in the process of rebuilding, these upgrades are much less expensive. And then part of that, you're gonna, like the flow meter might be $600. You might look at it and say, well, I really don't need it. But when you look at the cost savings over the years, it will pay for itself in other pieces of your bill.
And really, hose bibs, gas lines for barbecues, they're so inexpensive to put in when you're building the home, but to do additional ones after the home becomes very costly.
Right. Let's see, collective bargaining. And the concept behind this is most people who do this are in a region or they're on a street, and they'll go in and say, they'll divide it up and say, I need soils testing. And so one of the members will go and do the research. They'll decide on a vendor, and they'll say, we've got 10 houses on our cul-de-sac. Since you didn't have to go looking for 10 business opportunities, can you give us a discount? And so that's a cost savings they'll do. And so people generally have done that for soils testing, grading. For people who are acting, who have that, they're working with the builder. Some are able to do, in the more rural areas, they're able to do that with the trades. Solar is one that just tends to be very expensive, so there's cost savings to get there. Fencing is another. The sprinkler systems, any of those things are great opportunities for trying to leverage a collective effort to get you a cost savings.
And with gas prices, what they are, those subs, those people coming out and being able to work on 10 homes is really advantageous.
Yeah, no, thank you. ADUs, if they're allowed in your community, your city, as I mentioned earlier, it's a great resource for, especially if your additional living expenses is going to run out before you're rebuilt. It might be worth looking at that to see, if I rebuild that way I have time to figure out how I'm going to come up with the rest of the money. Or maybe you're going to build your house smaller because you don't have a mortgage and you're going to put on that rental income. Excuse me, sorry for the cough. In the more rural areas, especially, tiny homes are a consideration that a lot of folks are looking at. You just need to be aware of if your community requires it to be on a foundation for a temporary occupancy permit, or if they'll allow it to be on wheels. Building code upgrades, ordinance or law coverage, last topic. So what's included in those code upgrades? It depends. So as always, read your policy, the language varies. In general, this coverage pays you the amount to bring the house you lost up to current building code, up to your available policy limits. Meaning if they're going to give you 10%, they'll pay you up to that 10% for those things. So think single pane windows, the requirement might be dual pane windows now. And so what's the difference between the cost of single pane and the dual? That's that difference in a code upgrade. This means that things that were not there but are needed to be added in order to gain that occupancy, like Susan said, the 2x4s now become 2x6s. That's this differential here. And these costs are generally rolled into the purchase and upgrading of a new home. You need to work that out with your adjuster if you're buying a replacement home, not building. But that amount that's available to you is going to be determined by the old house, the house that was. Usually it's considered as paid when incurred, but sometimes the insurer will offer some discretion and just pay that up front. So part of that negotiation, if you feel like you need to have that in hand, work there. And often they're going to require that you or the builder show what those codes are. So a lot of times you'll get an adjuster that says, I need the list of building code upgrades. So I think in Boulder, the community is, someone in the community is putting together that list of what the most recent building code upgrades are. In California, there's the state code and then whatever is in your local jurisdiction. And so usually you can pull those two lists. It won't have the pricing attached to it, but it will at least give the list of what those things are. And this last bullet, often you must show that they're enforced the code to get payment. That is not necessarily true, but be aware that they might tell you that's a requirement. Some code upgrade examples, feel free to chime in on anything here. Installation requirements, the R value increasing, electrical arc fault outlets, and breakers. But it's the distance between your studs, fire blocking, fire sprinklers, the solar, as we mentioned, those other energy efficient upgrades. And here's an example of a sample building code upgrade that a city published. The city of Santa Rosa put this up and broke out exactly what was related to what, so that there was no question on the part of the insurance company or the builder what needed to be done. And here's a sample builder's code estimate, so we're going with this is what it's going to cost, the additional cost, that the breakout of the difference between. And then here's an example of a code estimate here. And this is an example that shows you a code upgrades broken out. All right, so anything the two of you would like to add about code upgrades? If not, I'm going to wrap us up. All right, well, I'd then like to thank our California and Colorado funders. And then for those of you who didn't get your question answered, or you feel like we didn't give you as robust an answer as you were looking for, because we were bouncing back and forth on speaking, if you go to our Ask an Expert form and register, you can ask your question there and we'll get you that answer from an expert in these professions. So I want to make sure that you have that information. Carolyn, I'm sure you've already put it in the chat, but if you make sure it's in the chat. And thank you, Susan and Annie, for joining us today. And any last words, guidance, advice, words that you'd like to share with folks before we wrap up?
I think what I would say is, as the message started, you will get through this. You have a lot of people cheering for you. So hang in there and we'll make it work.
There's silver linings in everything you go through. During my rebuild process, our community became extremely close. We got new houses, not necessarily what we wanted. We didn't ask for new houses, but we got new houses that we don't have to replace the roof on for 30 years. There are things that if you open your eyes to, that are there in front of you, that will help you through this process and will make you realize at the end of the day that there is some benefit to everything that happens in life.
Yeah, thank you both. And then I'm gonna, Jeff actually threw it into the Q&A. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So I'm gonna end with that. And then I'm gonna wrap us up with David's quote, "It's going to be okay." So thank you all for joining us. And
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
good luck with everything, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.
And Susan, you're great.